The millionaire sat in his grand office, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. His son, once full of energy and joy, had been battling a rare illness for the past year, and the doctors had been unable to find a solution. Every day felt like a struggle as he watched his child's health decline. Desperation clawed at him, but he refused to give up. He needed help. That's when he heard about the nanny. A woman who had a reputation for working wonders with children facing difficult circumstances. Her name had been whispered among the circles of parents whose children suffered from similar ailments. She came highly recommended, too highly to ignore. The father didn't hesitate. He arranged a meeting with her the very next day. She walked into his office, calm and composed, with an air of professionalism that put him at ease. She had a reassuring smile, and her voice was gentle yet confident. "I've worked with children who have illnesses like your son's," she said, offering a kind yet knowing look. "I'm here to help. I can be the support you both need." Her words comforted him. For the first time in months, he felt like there was hope. But something, deep down, nagged at him. He couldn't pinpoint what it was, just a slight unease, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. But his son was getting worse, and he couldn't afford to waste time. He agreed to hire her on the spot. The nanny moved in and began her work with his son right away. She was everything she had promised, efficient, caring, and attentive. She made sure his son followed a strict routine that she assured the father was vital to his recovery. He watched her with a mix of relief and suspicion. It wasn't that he didn't trust her, but the intensity with which she took control made him feel uneasy. Just to be cautious, the father decided to install a small security camera in his son's room. He told himself it was just a precaution, something to ensure everything was on track. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized it was also because he didn't completely trust the nanny, though he didn't want to admit it. One evening, after a long day of work, the father found himself in front of the camera footage. He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen, watching the nanny's movements as she attended to his son. She appeared normal at first, softly speaking to the boy, helping him settle into bed, even singing a lullaby. But then, something caught his eye. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it stopped him cold. The nanny seemed to pause at the door before turning off the light, her eyes lingering on the boy a little longer than necessary. A shiver ran down his spine. He dismissed it at first. Maybe it was nothing. Just a protective caregiver, ensuring her charge was truly asleep. But then, as he fast-forwarded the footage, the unease settled deeper within him. The next few frames didn't help. There was a certain tension in the air, a strange stillness. He leaned forward, his heart racing. He had to know what was going on. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake, one he might not be able to undo. The days dragged on, and while his son seemed to show signs of improvement, the father's unease grew. It wasn't that the nanny wasn't doing her job, she was. She was meticulous in every detail, from managing the boy's medication to following her carefully structured routines. In fact, his son had started to show some positive changes in his health, and for that, the father was grateful. But there was something unsettling about the nanny's presence, something that didn't sit right with him. At first, it was small things, the way she always made sure the boy ate exactly what she told him to, even if he wasn't hungry. Or how she insisted on being the one to administer his medication, never allowing the father to do it, despite his son's wish to have his father close during those moments. It was as if the nanny was not just taking charge but controlling every aspect of his son's life. One evening, the father came home earlier than usual. He had planned on spending some quality time with his son, but as he entered the house, he found the nanny in the living room, reading quietly to the boy, her voice soft but firm. She was so engrossed in the story that she didn't notice him standing in the doorway. He hesitated. His son looked content, listening intently to her voice. But there was something about the way the nanny spoke, a tone that was both soothing and strangely authoritative. The father's gut tightened. He didn't like it, but he couldn't pinpoint why. Later that evening, he installed another camera, this time in the living room. It wasn't that he didn't trust the nanny entirely, it was just that nagging feeling again, the feeling that something was being hidden from him. The next morning, the father watched the footage while having his coffee. The nanny had arrived at the house before sunrise, as usual, and immediately began preparing his son's breakfast. But as she stood by the stove, her back turned to the camera, the father caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. She was muttering something under her breath, words he couldn't quite make out. It wasn't a language he recognized, and the cadence was off. It sounded almost ritualistic. His mind raced. Could it be nothing? Was he just overthinking things? But the more he watched, the more the oddness of her behavior began to sink in. She wasn't just a nanny anymore, she was starting to feel like an intruder in his home, someone who had begun to command authority over his son, someone who was slowly but surely slipping into the very fabric of their lives. Over the following days, the odd occurrences multiplied. The nanny insisted on taking the boy to his doctor appointments, even when the father had cleared his schedule to go with him. She never asked for his input when it came to his son's care, always assuming she knew what was best. And there were moments when the boy seemed strangely distant, almost like he was becoming more attached to her than to his own father. One evening, after a tense dinner, the father asked his son, "How's everything going with the nanny, buddy? You like her?" His son smiled but said nothing, his gaze drifting toward the nanny. She stood silently in the background, eyes fixed on the boy. The moment felt heavy, like something was unspoken between them. The father didn't press further, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. He needed answers, he had to find out what was truly happening under his roof. That night, after his son had gone to sleep, the father pored over the camera footage again, heart racing in anticipation. He was ready to confront the nanny, ready to ask the questions that had been swirling in his mind. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw next. The footage showed the nanny speaking softly to his son, stroking his hair in a way that almost felt too intimate. And then, she whispered something that made the father's stomach churn, "We'll be fine. Just you and me, always." The words hit him like a ton of bricks. What was she really doing with his son? The father's worst fears had been realized. He wasn't just dealing with an overzealous caretaker, he was dealing with someone who had far more control over the situation than he had ever anticipated. His mind raced. What now? How had he not seen this before? He had to act fast. Before it was too late, the father couldn't sleep that night. His mind was a whirlwind of unanswered questions, and the strange footage he'd watched kept replaying in his head. The nanny's words, "Just you and me, always," echoed in his thoughts, each repetition making the situation feel more dangerous. Who was she really, and what was her true purpose? The next morning, he couldn't bear the weight of uncertainty any longer. He needed to dig deeper, uncover the truth. He quietly began his investigation, searching for any clue he could find. First, he checked her personal information. Everything seemed perfect on paper, too perfect. Her resume was flawless, her references impeccable. But as he scrolled through her background, something didn't add up. Her previous jobs were vague, and the addresses on her references were hard to trace. That's when he decided to go further. He hired a private investigator to look into her history. Days passed, and the father tried to keep his suspicions buried, focusing on his son's recovery. But every time the nanny was around, he felt a gnawing discomfort. He found himself watching her closely, noting her every move. One afternoon, the investigator called. "I've got some details on her, but you won't like what I've found." The father's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight. "She's not who she says she is," the investigator said. "The name she gave you, no one's heard of her in any of the places she's worked. She's been using fake identities and working under assumed names for years. I couldn't trace where she came from before she got to your family." A cold shiver ran down the father's spine. He had suspected something was off, but this was worse than he imagined. The nanny wasn't just being secretive, she was actively hiding her past. The realization hit him like a wave: she wasn't just looking after his son, she was playing a much deeper game. The father's thoughts turned to the son. His son, who had been doing better under the nanny's care, was now more attached to her than ever. The boy had grown distant, no longer seeking his father's comfort. The father tried to talk to his son about the nanny, but the child only gave vague, non-committal answers, as if he didn't want to say too much. The father's worry grew. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed answers. He needed to confront the nanny. That evening, after the boy had gone to sleep, the father waited until the nanny was alone in the living room. He approached her quietly, his heart pounding in his chest. She looked up as he entered, a smile on her face that seemed too forced, too rehearsed. "Is there something you want to talk about?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge of curiosity. The father crossed his arms, steadying his breath. "Who are you really?" The question came out sharper than he intended, but it felt like the only way to break the tension. The nanny's smile faltered for a moment, and for the first time, he saw something other than calm professionalism in her eyes. There was a flicker of something else, something cold, calculating. But she quickly regained composure, her smile returning. "I'm the nanny you hired to take care of your son," she said, her tone smooth and almost patronizing. "Is there a problem?" The father's fists clenched. He wasn't buying it. He could feel the lies behind her words, the falsehoods that were carefully crafted to manipulate him into trusting her. "You've been lying about everything," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You've been lying about who you are, and now you've got my son under your control." The nanny didn't flinch. Instead, she stood up slowly, walking toward him with a calm confidence. "You're upset," she said, almost patronizingly. "I understand. But everything I've done has been for your son's well-being. I've given him what he needed, what you couldn't give him." The father felt the anger rise in his chest. "No, you've been using him to get what you want. This whole time, you've been manipulating us both." The nanny's eyes darkened for a split second before she regained her composure. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "You never did. I was never just a nanny. I'm here to ensure things go according to plan." The father felt his blood run cold. He had no idea what she was talking about, but he knew enough to realize he had stumbled upon something much darker than he could have imagined. The confrontation had only just begun. What he didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a much larger web of lies, manipulation, and deception, a web that stretched far beyond the walls of his home. The father was standing on the edge of a precipice, and he had no idea just how deep the hole went. The father stood frozen in place, his mind racing. The nanny's words echoed in his ears, but they made no sense. "I'm here to ensure things go according to plan." What plan? What was she talking about? His son had been the center of his life, and now, it seemed, someone had been using him as a pawn in some twisted game. He needed answers. Desperate to uncover the truth, the father turned to his private investigator once again. "I need to know everything about her, where she came from, who she really is, and what she's been involved in. I need it all." The investigator promised to dig deeper, but the father couldn't sit idle. His mind swirled with paranoia. He needed to understand what he was up against. The nanny, with her calm demeanor and perfect facade, was not the person she had led him to believe. As the days passed, the father couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He noticed the nanny's presence around his son more than ever before, and the boy seemed to be responding to her every word, her every touch. There was something eerie in the way his son looked at her, as though they shared a secret he wasn't part of. One evening, when the nanny was out of the room, the father decided to search her belongings. He went through her things, nothing too intrusive, just looking for anything that might shed light on her past. His heart pounded in his chest as he rifled through her personal items, his fingers trembling as he picked up a small notebook. It looked old and well-worn, like it had been carried around for years. Flipping it open, he found a list of names, some crossed out, some circled, and a set of dates that didn't make sense. There were also references to different cities, different families. Each name was connected to a specific task or role, one of which stood out to the father more than the others: Project Guardian. His breath caught in his throat. What was this? Was the nanny part of something much larger than he could have imagined? The entries in the notebook were cryptic, and some of them seemed to refer to children who were cared for under mysterious circumstances. Some names were followed by words like unstable, failed, and terminated. Suddenly, a chill washed over the father. Was his son part of something dark, something beyond his control? His son had been struggling for so long, but he had never imagined that anyone would exploit his child's condition. The nanny was not just some caregiver, she was part of a network, an organization, and his son was at the center of it all. But there was no time to process what he'd found. He heard footsteps in the hall, and before he could react, the nanny appeared in the doorway, her face a perfect mask of innocence. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice laced with feigned concern. The father quickly closed the notebook, his heart racing. "Yeah, I'm fine," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just checking on something." The nanny eyed him suspiciously for a moment but then turned and walked out of the room without saying another word. He was sure she knew something was off. But what could he do now? The evidence he had uncovered was damning, but he had no proof. Not yet. The next morning, the private investigator called with the information the father had been waiting for. "I've got it," the investigator said. "You were right. There's more to her than meets the eye." The father's stomach twisted as he listened intently. "She's been moving around a lot, using fake identities," the investigator continued. "But there's one thing that stands out. She's been linked to a powerful organization involved in secretive medical research. They specialize in high-risk treatments and have a track record of using children in their experiments. Your son, he's been on their radar for a long time." The father's world tilted. His son, the boy he had been doing everything to protect, had been targeted by these people. But why? What was the connection between his son's illness and this shadowy organization? The investigator's voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm sending you everything I've found. Be careful. This is bigger than you think." The father felt like he was standing at the edge of an abyss. His mind raced as he processed the new information. The nanny wasn't just taking care of his son, she was part of a much darker, more dangerous plan. And now, it was up to him to stop it. As he hung up the phone, the father turned to the camera footage from the past few days. His eyes burned as he watched the nanny interact with his son again. The boy seemed to have become more withdrawn, more obedient to her every whim. It was as if the boy had been slowly brainwashed. The footage showed the nanny speaking to him softly, always in control, always with that same eerie calm. What had she done to his son? Was he too far gone to save? The father's heart broke as he realized just how deep he was in. He was no longer just trying to protect his son from a mysterious illness, he was trying to save him from a far greater threat, one that was hiding right in his own home. He had to act now. But what could he do when the enemy was someone he had trusted, someone who had become part of his son's life? The answers were coming too slowly, but one thing was clear: the father was now in a race against time. And every second counted. The father could feel the weight of the situation crushing him. His world had been turned upside down, and the pieces of the puzzle were scattered in every direction. His son, the boy he loved more than anything, had become the target of a sinister plan. The nanny, who had seemed so kind and professional, was part of something dark, a network of people involved in dangerous, unethical experiments. The clock was ticking, and the father knew he had to act quickly. But how? What could he do when he wasn't even sure who to trust anymore? The investigator's information had been enough to confirm his worst fears, but it was still just a trail of breadcrumbs leading into darkness. He needed more. He needed the truth. As the days passed, the father found himself watching his son with increasing concern. The boy had become quieter, more distant. It was as though he had retreated into himself, as though the nanny had somehow gained control of his very thoughts. The father tried to talk to him, tried to reconnect, but the boy's responses were slow, disconnected. He barely met his father's eyes, and when he did, there was a strange emptiness in his gaze. One night, the father made a decision. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to confront the nanny, this time, with the full force of the truth behind him. He waited until the house was silent, until the boy was fast asleep. The nanny was in the kitchen, as always, preparing her usual late-night tea. The father approached her slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He was determined to end this madness, no matter the cost. He entered the kitchen, his voice steady but full of the anger that had been building inside him for days. "I know who you are," he said, locking eyes with her. "I know what you've been doing, and I know what you've been doing to my son." The nanny's expression didn't change. She stood tall, calm, like she had been waiting for this moment. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice smooth, almost too calm. "I've been caring for your son, giving him what he needs." The father could barely contain his fury. "No, you haven't. You've been controlling him. Manipulating him. You've been using him for something, and I'm not going to let you destroy him." The nanny's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, the father saw a flicker of something in them, a glimmer of recognition. "You don't understand," she said softly. "You think you're protecting him, but you have no idea what he really needs. No idea what he needs to survive." The father's mind spun. "What are you talking about? What does he need?" Her eyes darkened, her voice low. "He needs to be part of something bigger. He's special. He has potential, potential that you'll never understand. This isn't just about his health, you see. It's about his future." The words hung in the air, thick with menace. The father felt his blood run cold. He had suspected something larger was at play, but hearing it from her own lips made it all too real. "What do you mean by his future?" The father's voice was barely a whisper. "What have you done to him?" The nanny took a slow step toward him, her demeanor strangely calm. "He's been chosen," she said. "Chosen for something that will change everything. His illness, his weakness, it's a part of the process. They needed him to be like this, to be weak, so they could make him strong. Stronger than you could ever imagine." The father's heart thudded painfully in his chest. "What are you talking about? Who is they?" Her smile was cold, knowing. "The organization I work for. We specialize in altering genetics. In enhancing the human body. Your son is the perfect subject. They've been watching him for years. He's part of an experiment, one that will change the course of humanity." The father's head spun. It was all too much to process. Genetic manipulation? His son, the child he had thought of as just sick, as vulnerable, was being used as a test subject in a horrific experiment? The anger inside him flared to life, hotter than ever. "You won't get away with this," the father said, his voice trembling with rage. "I will stop you. I'll stop all of you." The nanny's smile didn't falter. "You're not in control here. You never were. Your son's future isn't in your hands anymore. It's in ours. And you're too late to change anything." The father felt a surge of panic. If what she was saying was true, his son was already too deep in this experiment. The boy's health, his behavior, it all made sense now. But how could he get him out of this? How could he protect him from this twisted future that the nanny and her organization had planned for him? He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going to back down. He would find a way to fight back, no matter what it took. He had to save his son. In that moment, the father knew he was no longer just a parent fighting for his child's health. He was fighting for his child's freedom, and for the very soul of the boy he loved. And he would not let this woman or the organization control him, or his son, any longer. The war had just begun. The father's mind raced as he stood face to face with the nanny, the truth about her intentions finally sinking in. His son, his precious child, was a pawn in a sinister game, one that went far beyond what he had imagined. The nanny, with her calm demeanor and calculated words, was a cog in a machine that was determined to shape his son into something else, something he couldn't yet fully understand. But one thing was clear: he couldn't let this continue. He had to act quickly before it was too late. The father's thoughts raced as he tried to come up with a plan. He couldn't confront the nanny directly; she had too much power, too much control over the situation. He needed to gather more information, find a way to stop this experiment without tipping off the organization that was behind it. And most importantly, he needed to get his son away from the nanny before she could do any more damage. With his mind set on action, he turned and walked toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The nanny watched him silently, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. She knew that he had learned too much, and she wasn't going to let him interfere with the plan. "You can't run from this," she called after him, her voice cold. "It's already too late." But the father didn't look back. He had no time to argue with her. He needed to get to the boy, and he needed to do it fast. As he rushed upstairs to his son's room, a thought struck him: what if the nanny had already prepared for this? What if she had already planned for him to try to intervene? He couldn't take any chances. He had to act like this was a normal night, like nothing was wrong. When he entered his son's room, the boy was lying in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. The father's heart ached as he saw the emptiness in his son's eyes. It wasn't the illness that had made him this way, it was the nanny. She had been slowly taking away his son's agency, turning him into someone he barely recognized. "Hey, buddy," the father said gently, sitting down beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" The boy didn't answer at first. He simply turned his head to look at his father, his eyes distant, as though he was seeing him through a fog. "I'm okay, Dad," the boy finally whispered, his voice flat. The father's heart clenched. The boy's spirit was breaking, and it was clear that the nanny's influence was the cause. But how could he pull him out of this? How could he break through the wall the nanny had built around his son's mind? He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Listen to me, son. I know something's been going on, something strange. You don't have to listen to her anymore. I'll protect you. Whatever happens, we'll get through this together." For a brief moment, the boy's eyes flickered with something: fear, maybe, or recognition. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the blank expression that had become so familiar. The father swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the situation press down on him. "You're not alone," the father whispered, more to himself than to his son. "I won't let her take you from me. Not again." The boy didn't respond, but the father could feel the pull of the nanny's influence still holding him captive. He couldn't give up. Not now. The father turned and walked out of the room, his mind swirling with plans. He needed to get his son away from the house, away from the nanny's reach. But how? The nanny had thought of everything; she had control over every aspect of their lives now. He couldn't do this alone. He needed help, someone who could fight the organization from the inside, someone who had the resources to take down this powerful network. But who? And where could he find them before it was too late? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. The father quickly darted into the hallway, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't be caught. Not yet. He needed to think fast. Time was running out. The organization, the nanny, everything was closing in on him. But there was no turning back now. His son was his only priority, and no matter what it took, he would bring him home. The father's plan had just begun, and every moment counted. He needed to act fast, gather the right people, and take down the organization that had infiltrated his family. The clock was ticking, and he couldn't afford to waste another second. With every step, he knew the stakes were rising higher. But one thing was certain, he was in this fight to win. For his son. For their future. The father moved quickly through the house, each step heavier than the last. His mind raced with possibilities, but the solution was nowhere in sight. The nanny's influence on his son had grown so strong that he couldn't even reach the boy. He had to do something, now. But how could he stop an organization so vast, so powerful, with no one to help him? He knew he was running out of time. The nanny was already a step ahead, and he could feel the walls closing in. There was no more room for hesitation. He couldn't just wait for the right moment. He had to take control. Determined to take the fight to the nanny, the father decided to confront her once and for all. He couldn't let her continue her manipulation. She had to know that he was no longer willing to be a passive player in her twisted game. He found her in the living room, sitting on the couch as though nothing was wrong. She looked up as he entered, her calm expression never wavering. "So, you've decided to confront me," she said, her voice almost amused. "It's about time." The father's chest tightened with fury. He took a deep breath to steady himself before speaking. "I know what you're doing. I know what you've been doing to my son. You're not his caregiver. You're his captor. And I'm not going to let you continue." The nanny's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of innocence, it was a smile of someone who had already won. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate. "You think you can stop me?" Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it now. "You think you can take back control? It's already too late." The father stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "I'm not afraid of you. And I won't let you take my son from me. Whatever you've done to him, whatever hold you have on him, it ends tonight." For a moment, they stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. The father could feel the weight of everything he had discovered pressing down on him, the lies, the manipulation, the dark forces pulling his son into their web. He knew he couldn't back down now. He had to fight for his child, no matter the cost. "You think I've been manipulating him," the nanny said with a cold laugh. "You think you know what's best for him? You've never understood what he truly needs. He's been chosen for something bigger than you or I. You can't save him, not now." The father's fists clenched. "You're wrong. He's my son. And I will do whatever it takes to save him." The nanny's smile faded. "You can't stop this. I've already made sure of that." She stepped toward him, her presence like a looming shadow. "You're just a pawn in a game that's already been decided." "And you," she stopped short, her eyes narrowing. "You're a fool if you think you can change anything now." Her words stung, but the father didn't flinch. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let her scare him into submission. "I'll find a way to undo everything you've done. I'll take him back, and we'll get out of here. You can't control us anymore." For a brief moment, the nanny's expression flickered. It was only for an instant, but the father saw it, the hint of uncertainty behind her calm exterior. He seized the opportunity. "You're not as invincible as you think," he said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "I'll expose you for what you really are. I'll bring down everything you've built. You've made a mistake underestimating me." The nanny's expression hardened once again, but the father could see the hesitation in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He had rattled her. She wasn't as confident as she had been moments ago. "I'll make sure you regret this," she said through gritted teeth, but the father could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. She knew that the game was changing. Just as he prepared to leave, the nanny stepped in front of him, blocking the doorway. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You really think you can save him? You really think you can undo what's been done?" The father didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure how, but he knew he had to keep moving forward. The nanny could not be allowed to win. "I don't know how yet," he said, his voice filled with determination, "but I will." With that, he brushed past her, heading straight for his son's room. He didn't know what would happen next or how he would bring this to an end, but he had no choice. He couldn't let the nanny keep controlling his son. As he opened the door to his son's room, he was met with silence. The boy was still lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, lost in his thoughts. But this time, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes when he saw his father standing in the doorway. "Dad?" The boy's voice was soft, almost like a question. The father smiled, relief flooding his chest. "Yes, son. It's me." The boy blinked, his gaze a little clearer than before. I didn't know where you went." "I'm here now," the father said, walking over to the bed and sitting down beside his son. "And I'm not going anywhere. We're going to get through this together. I promise you." The boy didn't say anything, but the father could see the faintest glimmer of hope in his eyes. The nanny had been right about one thing: his son had been chosen. But now, the father had made his own choice. He had chosen to fight for his son, to take back control. And he would stop at nothing to save him from the dark future that had been planned for him. The battle was far from over, but the father knew one thing: this was only the beginning. And he wasn't going to let anyone take his son away from him, no matter what it took. The father's heart beat heavily in his chest as he sat beside his son. The boy's face, once filled with confusion and fear, now held the faintest trace of recognition. His son was still in a fog, a victim of the nanny's influence and the dark plans of the organization behind her, but the father could see the spark of his old self returning. He wasn't lost completely, not yet. But the clock was ticking. The nanny was already onto him, and if she had been this far ahead once, she would be again. There was no time to waste. The father looked down at his son, the boy who had once been full of life and laughter, now caught in the snare of someone else's game. But his son still had a chance, they still had a chance, if he could act quickly enough. "I'm going to get you out of here," the father whispered, brushing a lock of hair from his son's forehead. "We're going to leave this place, and we'll go somewhere safe. You'll be okay." His son didn't respond. But the father knew the nanny's grip on him wasn't as strong as it had been. The boy was still there, deep down. The father would find a way to bring him back completely. The door to the room creaked open, and the father stiffened. His heart raced. It was the nanny. She had come to check on them, or worse, she had realized he was planning to leave. The father had to think fast. Without a word, he grabbed his son's hand and gently guided him out of bed. "We're going," the father said in a firm whisper. His son's eyes widened in confusion, but there was a flicker of understanding in his gaze. The father moved quickly, holding his son's hand tightly. He could hear the soft sound of footsteps growing closer, and he knew time was running out. They had to make it to the door, to the back of the house where he had hidden an old car, one that had been parked out of sight for emergencies. It was their only chance. The father's mind raced as they tiptoed down the hall. He could hear the nanny's voice calling from behind, but he couldn't stop now. His son needed him more than ever. "Where do you think you're going?" The nanny's voice was cold, sharp, and filled with fury. The father didn't look back as he reached the back door. He had no time to argue with her, no time to explain. He had made his decision, he wasn't leaving without his son. The moment the door clicked open, the father hurried outside, pulling his son along with him. He could hear the nanny's footsteps echoing behind them. She was getting closer. "Dad!" His son's voice was trembling now. "What's happening? Where are we going?" The father squeezed his son's hand tighter. "We're getting away from her, son. I'll explain everything later. Just trust me." As they reached the car, the father turned to face the approaching threat. He knew the nanny wouldn't stop, not now that she understood how far he was willing to go. His only hope was to buy some time, to get his son far enough away to protect him. The car started with a roar as the father jumped in, pulling his son into the passenger seat beside him. The tires screeched as they tore out of the driveway, away from the house, and into the night. The nanny was nowhere in sight, but the father knew it wouldn't be long before she or someone else from the organization found them. The escape had only just begun. But as the car raced through the empty streets, the father found his resolve hardening. They weren't just escaping from the nanny. They were escaping from an entire system, an organization that had taken everything from them. But it didn't matter. This was his son, and no one was going to take him away again. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: no matter what lay ahead, the father would fight with every ounce of his being to protect his son. The war wasn't over, but he had made his choice. His son was going to be free. The road ahead was uncertain, and every turn felt like an unknown, but the father kept his hands firmly on the wheel, his mind focused on the most important thing in his life, his son. The night was quiet except for the hum of the tires against the asphalt, but inside, the father was fighting a storm of emotions. His son sat quietly beside him, looking out the window, lost in his thoughts. The boy was still weak, his mind still recovering from the manipulation that had kept him captive for so long, but the father could see the faintest glimmer of hope in his eyes. His son was coming back to him, and with every mile they put between themselves and the nanny, the future seemed a little brighter. But even as the father drove, he knew this escape wasn't the end. The organization that had pulled his son into its web wasn't going to let them go so easily. They would come after them. He couldn't afford to stop. But as long as his son was by his side, he had the strength to face whatever came next. Looking at his son, the father felt a sense of peace. It wasn't that the battle was won, but that he had made the right choice. He had chosen his son, his family, and the future that they would build together. He had chosen to fight, because love, above all, would always find a way. "You're safe now," the father said, his voice soft but resolute. "And I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. I won't let anyone take you from me again." His son looked up, a faint smile on his face. "I know, Dad. I know." And in that moment, the father understood something deeper. The true strength of a parent's love isn't just in protecting their child physically, it's in never giving up on them, in fighting for their future, no matter how dark the world may seem. Together, they would face whatever came next. And together, they would be unstoppable. The road ahead was still uncertain, but as long as they had each other, they would find a way. And that was the greatest lesson of all. The end was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where they were finally free.